global economic governance and planning. We wanted to build a very special panel around this issue, and we actually asked one of our favorite moderators, Philip Stevens of the Financial Times, to lead the discussion. So I'll turn it over to Philip to introduce the panel. Come on in.
Thank you, Craig, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. I had intended to sort of strike a chord of sort of modesty at the beginning of this panel, and then I thought better of it. Because the facts, I think, speak for themselves. We have the best panel, and we have the most important subject. The best panel, well, we have Gordon Brown, Robert Zoellick, Pascal Lamy, and Michel Pébereau. I don't think I have to say any more than that. The most important subject, well, understandably, a lot of the discussions this weekend are going to be, and rightly so, about the urgent crises, problems, and opportunities facing the world, particularly the uprisings in North Africa and the Middle East, also the consequences of the tragic natural disasters in Japan. But it seems to me that we also need to connect the urgent to the important. That's what the best statesmen, I think, do. History's taught us that. So the important, I think, is the capacity of the international community to deal with these issues depends critically on whether it builds the rules, the institutions, and the systems of international governance sufficient to address these sort of problems. So our subject is, where does the G20 fit in this? Is it, after its successes in tackling the global financial crisis, going to be the pillar of a new global order? Or is it going to turn out to be a talking shop, albeit a useful one? As I said, we couldn't have a better panel to discuss that. And I'm going to start with a question to each of our panel, and then I'm going to throw it open pretty quickly. Gordon Brown, I mean, if one borrows a phrase from Dean Acheson, you were present at the creation, as it were. The London G20 summit in 2009 was widely seen as the sort of watershed moment when the global financial system was pulled back from the brink. You've written eloquently since on where we need to go forward, how to build global governance. Two questions. And by the way, Gordon Brown's book, I've noticed, is on sale outside, so I recommend it, having read it myself. When you look at the G20 now, standing back a bit, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? What's the G20? What have people got? What have governments got right? What have they got wrong? Where should we head next?
I remember when we brought people together for the first time at the G20 in London, saying to the people who were assembled and quoting the words of Churchill about the 1930s, when he said of the attempts to deal with a recession in the 1930s that people had been resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence. And in the 1930s, as we know from our history, international cooperation not only failed, but we had protectionism, and we eventually had conflict. I think we should be determined that we do things differently when dealing with crises in the future. And I suppose the positive thing is that the world did come together to stop a recession becoming a depression. I think the disappointing thing is that the world has not gone on, either through the G20 or through the international institutions generally, to do the other two things that we set out to try to do in April 2009. And the first of these two things was to rebuild the global financial system. And I still believe that we have got a series of national regulatory systems trying to deal with a global financial problem. And the second thing is that we needed to move forward to create what I would call a global growth pact. You see, 50 years or 100 years from now, people will look back and they will see that this was the biggest period of transformation that the world had ever seen since the Industrial Revolution. And the attitudes of people, the discontent, the protectionism, the demonstrations, the kicking out incumbent governments are all part of that. We've got this major change taking place, billions of people joining the industrial economy. And this change is only half complete. We're in a transition to the next stage, which is the growth, if you like, of a middle class in different parts of the world, billions of people in the end becoming part of that consuming middle class. And so the rebalancing of the world economy will take place at some point. So we're in this transition, but we don't have the global institutions to deal with it. So we have food prices and rising, and we don't seem to have a global answer. We have volatility in energy markets and issues of nuclear power, and that does relate to the supply of energy and demand for energy around the world. We have Pascal trying very bravely, and I do applaud him, to find a trade deal, but we could have the first trade deal that fails since 1948 if we cannot get the world acting together. We don't have a global growth pact, despite everything that Bob and others have been trying to do. And we've got this imbalance in the world economy, and it should be sorted out far more quickly, in my view, by international cooperation. And we can prove that international cooperation could have a higher growth rate, probably get about 50 million more people into work, take 100 million people out of poverty. It can be done. So the first stage was to deal with the recession. The second and third stages to rebuild the financial system and to have a global growth pact that actually works and coordinates the economies that are now global but acting as if we're all retreating into national shells at the moment. That is still to happen, and I think that is the disappointment after 2009, that too many countries are retreating into the national shells and making it impossible for the benefits of global cooperation to be gained. When I was chairman of the IMF committee, we had a demonstration outside one of our meetings, and the banner that was being most obvious to me at that meeting was one which said, actually, Worldwide Campaign Against Globalization. I think, Pascal, the French did one better in 2009. The anti-globalization protesters had a campaign in 2008 which said no to 2009. And there is a huge danger, unless we act together, that this retreat into anti-globalization protests and into protectionism will become a greater reality. And the people like Bob and Pascal, and I know Michel, who are trying to avoid this, have got to be given all the international support that they need and should have.
And just very quickly, is the G20 the right organisation?
The G20 has got to change to become a constituency organisation. I think Pascal's got the same view of this. It's got to represent the G192, if you like. Remember, the G20 is not 20, it's about 26 or 30 in the end who get round that table. But you've got to give every country some role in this by giving them some representation, if indirectly, through a constituency system. So one country will represent a number of countries, as happens at the IMF, and it's got to be a G192 in the end, with the 20 or 30 people who are sitting down at the table more representative of the continents and the regions from which they come. And so you move from a G8, which is insufficient to deal with the world's problems, to a G20, but build a constituency system that gets you to a representational forum where countries can feel that they are not neglected. Otherwise, the voices of Africa and Asia and Latin America will not feel heard. And clearly, the voices of the Middle East and North Africa are ones that are not being heard at the moment in international forums in the way they should.
Thank you. Pascal Lamy, Gordon Brown said you've laboured mightily, first as a European Trade Commissioner, since at the WTO, to build this more cohesive, open, global trading system. And I think everyone in this room would agree we need it. The G20, no G20 communique is complete without a commitment to push this forward with this process. Is the problem that simply a lot of these trade issues are just intractable, or is the problem that the G20 isn't the place to sort them out, as it were? And to pick up Gordon Brown's point, can you see it? How do you see it building it possibly as a constituency organisation?
Well, on your first question, I think trade is a good sort of test of what the G20 can do and cannot do. And it's a good example of why the G20, contrary to many public perceptions, is not a government of the world. It's one important, necessary piece of a very complex system of global governance, which has many other bits, but which the G20 can energize, can trigger. So where the G20 is useful is for sort of leadership, impulsions, knowing that the capacity of the G20 itself to deliver is nil. And by the way, I'm certainly not an advocate of institutionalizing the G20, of putting one more bureaucracy secretariat around this. And if I look at trade, basically the G20 did very well on the defensive and did poorly on the offensive. It did very well on two major defensives, which were the threat of protectionism during the crisis, and that was well done overall. And the G20 also did well on a less visible topic, but which Bob and I know is of major importance, which is trade finance, at a time where world trade was risking to be sort of strangled by a constriction of the credit system, notably on trade finance and notably for developing countries. Now, on these two areas, the G20 did the right thing at the right moment with the right energy. Now, where the G20 did less well, obviously, is on the offensive agenda, which is the Doha Round, which, as many of you know, is stuck. And it's stuck basically on a US-China difference on a number of industrial tariff lines. And to answer directly your question, I'll answer your question by another question. Do you think President Hu Jintao and President Obama can enter into the complex tariff structure of the chemical industry and decide which of the lines would go down by 1%, which of the lines would go down by 0.5% among the 350 chemical tariff lines which are there?
So that's it, is it, though? Are we saying that the whole global trading system is being held up because Hu Jintao and President Obama can't be expected to get into chemical tariff lines?
The reality is that they've said the right things. In Seoul, we had a very good discussion at lunch on trade. President Obama said for the first time, and it was important that he would say this, if there is a good deal on the table, I'll take it to Congress, which is a major pronunciation for a US president to say, I'm ready to engage Congress on a trade deal, which, as you know, is not that easy down there. Now, once this is done, this is where the G20 can do things and cannot do other things. It has to trickle down to negotiators finding the right compromise. For the moment, they haven't done that. They have their political instructions. The G20 said you should get there, but there are a few chemical constituencies in the US who want a Chinese scalp, and there are a few Chinese constituencies in the chemical industry who are not that ready to give a Chinese scalp. And the question is just, what's the final dimension of this? Now, on your second question, like Gordon, I believe at the end of the day, the only way to address the legitimacy problem of the G20, and the G20 has a legitimacy problem, notably vis-à-vis the UN system, is to switch it into something that would resemble Bob's board, Dominique Strauss-Kahn's board, which is a constituency system. And it's, by the way, it's taking this direction, except for the Eurozone. And I won't come back on what I said last year in the same place, because it obviously ruffled a few feathers, and I frankly shouldn't do that. For the rest, when you see that you now have 2 or 3 African representatives, you have the chair, the rotating chair of the ASEAN, for instance, it's going in this direction, and I think it's a good direction.
So we should stick with it, yeah. Okay. Michel Pébereau, you bring a rather different perspective to this conversation as chairman of BNP Paribas, one of Europe's world's biggest banks. We've heard G20 saved the global financial system. Banks haven't had a great press in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, quite a lot of people think we saved the banks, as it were, the taxpayers, and as we look at the Eurozone, we see problems now. But I'd like to focus on the role of, we seem to have regulation at every different level now. We have national, European, we have the IMF with a role, and the G20. Looking from the sort of private sector end of the telescope, how's the G20 going, and is it the right place, if you like, to package a global system of financial regulation, banking regulation?
Yes, first of all, I have to mention that the G20 was a necessity at the moment when it was created. Because at this moment, from the point of view of the private sector, what was essential was to create, again, confidence. The main issue at this moment was that at the level of the public opinion, worldwide, but essentially in the US and in Europe, there was a problem of confidence, and people were stopping investments as well at the level of individuals as at the level of companies. People were stopping investments, were stopping buying, were just saving money. And so this group was created at a moment when confidence was a necessity. And the size of the group, what it represented at the level of the world, was just adapted to that issue. After that, the question was to know what they had to do. And 2 issues were on the table. One was how to restore growth, and the other was to create a climate of financial stability. And on those 2 fields, at the end of the day, the G20 was useful. And to stay on the field of financial stability, well, they have, from the beginning, stated what was the different fields in which it was a necessity to try to have new rules. You know, they have not the capacity to decide for rules. Same story for Basel Committee. It's not a decision-making system. It's just a system in which some people are trying to create a consensus from which there is a possibility in each country to make its own decisions. And what is very important today is to keep the G20 at the level of, some kind of consensus up to the Basel Committee, because Basel Committee is just regulators, and decisions have to be made at the political level. It's from law that you can regulate the banking sector. So you need the two stages. At the level of Basel Committee, it's possible to discuss technical issues, but final decisions will be made at the level of G20. And what is very important is that those decisions will be implemented worldwide. And it is only the politicians which have the capacity to decide so. So today,
it's important worldwide for competition matters, or?
It is important for stability, because what has been demonstrated in the past was that, some problems at the level of supervision in the United States created a problem for the worldwide. Financial crisis started from US banks, investment banks, and American regulators. Then it came in Europe, and in Europe the problem was again a problem in some banks and some countries. But it was not a global problem. My bank had no problem with this crisis. We made money in 2008, 3 billion as a profit. So the question of the financial stability is a very important one for everybody, and so it is the reason why we are, all of us, all bankers, in favor of a better regulation, but also I am personally in favor of a better supervision, because one of the two issues which appeared during this crisis was also supervision.
Okay. I detect, perhaps I'm just a journalist looking for splits, but I detect a slight difference between Gordon Brown and your views on the role of the G20. But we can come back on the financial side, but perhaps we can come back to that. I want to turn to.
I don't actually think there's such a huge division there.
As I said, I'm a journalist looking for splits.
I want to disappoint you as a journalist in searching for a headline. I think we're all talking about a multilateralism. So you've got a number of international institutions that have different roles. You're not going to be able to talk in the end about one single institution, even on economic policy that is overwhelmingly powerful. But the G20 will have to be the premier institution for economic coordination, and will have, as Pascal says, legitimacy as long as it can build some form of constituency system that involves countries who are outside it. But I just think that the problems that have just been raised as we've talked show why there is actually an urgency about making this system work better. To me, you've got an imbalanced world economy. You've got far higher levels of unemployment than you need to have. You've got global growth that is probably reaching its peak, actually, given what's happening in Asia and the inability of Europe and America to grow fast. You've got the trade problems that Pascal has identified. And if there is no coordination, the world will grow at a lower rate than it should. Okay. And if there is no coordination, we'll have millions of people unemployed in a way that is unnecessary. And if there is no coordination, the very trade deal that is actually in the interest of both America and China, as well as the rest of the world, will not happen. And it does need a political push for these things to be made possible. And Pascal's right. I mean, there's no American president or Chinese president who should be involved in the detail of delivering a particular chemicals percentage. But the political will has got to be expressed so it actually happens, and that's why you need an organisation such as the G20.
I think this is going to be
moving forward.
I think this is going to be the core of a lot of our conversation. But I want to come to Robert Zoellick, who, in a way, it seems to me, sits at in a unique position because he's at the at the head of the World Bank. He's at the intersection, as it were, of the new and the old powers, and sees that interaction very at close quarters. And I want to ask him two things. One, the question of how does he think the G20 is working, and two, how does it fit with the financial institutions set up in 1945 or after 1945? But I also wanted to broaden the discussion a little bit by asking him, is this an organization that's destined to remain entirely economic, or will it go the way that the G7 did over time, branching out from economics into politics? I mean, presumably, Bill Hillartz, the G20 is going to have something to say about what's happening in the Middle East this year.
Well, first, I sometimes feel the G20 is an organization for our era because the numbers don't add up, as Gordon said. There's actually many more than 20, and there's an evolving process here. But let me try to connect a couple of thoughts in answering your question, and start out by saying that Gordon really does deserve, I think, some considerable credit for the leadership in London. And that is not only a compliment to him, but it's also, I think, an observation for the future, which is you hear a lot of talk about multilateralism. Multilateralism doesn't work unless there's leadership within it. So it's nice to have everybody around the table, but you have to figure out some drivers of the system. Now, if you think a little bit about what happened at London, and I was just reflecting on this here, it also tells you a little bit about the way that the G20 can be effective. Number one, it talked about a big increment of additional resources for the IMF, which was necessary but also created confidence. So it was resources for one of the current structures. Second, Pascal and I and a few others brought something to the table from existing institutions to try to deal with the trade finance problem. So it used some of the existing institutions. Third, in the area of financial regulation, people knew this was going to be, in supervision, a key issue, but the system wasn't really capable of dealing with it, so that they took this financial stability forum, which was really an instrument created in a different context with a smaller number of countries, and expanded it to a larger role, which hasn't yet completed its role, but in a sense created another piece of the network. And the fourth piece, and I think this will be the tricky one, was it aggregated a series of national actions. Because we can't forget, you've got sovereign countries here, and part of the problem now is they perceive their situation a little bit differently. But I think it's important to recognize, in that sense, what the G20 did with the right leadership was play a role as a steering group. So like Pascal, I think it would be deadly to create a secretariat and a bureaucracy. The steering group needs to use the existing institutions and needs to figure out how to get their ideas, how to resource them. The G20 then later helped build capital increases for the World Bank and from some of the regional development banks, and in a sense see this as a networked model. Now, as part of that network, I think there's two key components to the legitimacy. One you've heard talked about, and I think the system is evolving towards this idea where you will have some regional representatives. I think Gordon had invited ASEAN. There's some from the African Union, APEC. This is still in a state of evolution. Since we're in a European capital, I'll just say, because people often won't say this, it's still a little odd that of those 25, 26 at the table, about 9 are European. And, you know, of course, each European has a good justification for being there. But I can tell you, as a non-European, doesn't bother me, I work with it, but some other non-Europeans will say, how come you have that sort of composition? That's something that Europe's going to have to figure out for the future. Europe represents itself as a regional organization through the Commission and the Presidency. It also there is individual states, and a large number of states. So as we think about where this then goes for the future, I think it's important to try to connect this with realistic expectations. You asked about political issues. The strength of the G20 now is you've got more players, the emerging markets, that's absolutely critical compared to the G8. The weakness is you've got more players, and it's harder to get things done in a bigger group. And I think that's one reason I would look to leadership in small subgroups, not necessarily formally done, but informally done. You have the EU countries, you have APEC countries, you have NAFTA countries, you have the G7, G8. The groups that are going to be most effective on issues are if they cross developed and developing country lines, and they become catalysts for action and to try to give general guidance to others going through, including on WTO issues. Climate change is an interesting one. I forget if Gordon tried to push this one, but I think in a little later there was some effort to bring climate change into the discussion. At first, China resisted, and in part it goes to the point that Pascal mentioned to say, look, this is in a UN forum. We don't want to take it out of the UN forum. But interestingly enough, by the time of the Seoul meeting, China had switched to realize, well, we could have a discussion here as long as we don't make the decision here if it helps prod along a process. And this is the second part of legitimacy, which is effectiveness. And this is, I think, critically important because very often the discussion is who's at the table, so on and so forth. If an international grouping doesn't do things, I'm afraid at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who's sitting at the table, people will ignore it. And then connecting that to your broader discussion going forward, Gordon mentioned some topics such as food price, both long-term food security, food price volatility. These are items on the agenda. And just to give you an example of how this works, President Sarkozy has identified those topics. He's put them out in one framework representing kind of his perspectives and also perhaps some of the national positioning. We're trying to work across different groups to say what could be done practically, not just with the World Bank, but with the WTO, with World Food Program, other different national programs, fitting other things together. And I think if you look at most of the agenda going forward, it will be of this nature. Now, the Middle East and North Africa is an intriguing one. There was a discussion at the finance ministers G20 a couple of weeks ago, and what one encountered was even very mild language on this was blocked because you do have political differences in this group. And so I think my own view is that the G20 this year is going to have to deal with this issue one way or the other because it's going to be one of the big issues of 2011. But how it works through the politics of discussing the economic recovery, safety net programs, long-term investment is still going to have to be determined. So I see this as an evolutionary process, see it as a series of networks, but critically important, it won't work without leadership.
And presumably the G20 can't really have a conversation about democracy.
No, but what can it have a conversation about are things such as we're also seeing in the street in the Middle East and North Africa, which is social accountability. Okay. All successful developing countries, one form or another, whether they're democratic or authoritarian, figure out some way to engage their public. It's not a top-down process. They can have discussions about the appropriate governance or anti-corruption systems. You can have appropriate discussions about how you engage the community in a development process. And you can also have discussions about some economic topics. I mean, if we combine the concern that Gordon and I talked about rising food prices with a transition process in North Africa, looking at, for example, the fact that Egypt is a major wheat importer and looking at the fact that its subsidy programs provide bread to about 85% of the people, you got a problem on the horizon.
Okay. So we've had some very rich contributions. G20 is a good thing, but it's got a way to go. I could ask half a dozen questions, but I'm gonna stand back and let you ask questions, make points, make arguments, debate. You don't have to agree with our panel. You don't have to agree with with each other. So, who would like to kick us off? Gentlemen.
I'm Barry Eichengreen from the University of California. My question is about effectiveness. At the center of the G20 process this year is global rebalancing. There is the development of a set of indicators and a peer review process and so forth and so on. What should make us think that the big countries involved in this process, the U.S. and China, will pay attention, much less change their domestic policies? And if not, how can the process be changed to make that happen?
I'm going to take a couple more and then come back to you if that's all right. There's one at the back over there and then one just... Okay.
Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform in London. Nobody said very much yet about China, and although Philip is right to say it's a great panel, it would have been even greater to have a senior Chinese policymaker there. China's foreign policy is worrying many people, creating problems and anxieties in its neighbourhood. But in terms of its commitment to global governance, my question to the panellists is it playing the game more and more? Is it playing a more constructive role? Is it accepting strong rules-based institutions? Do they see a positive trend on China and global governance?
Okay, I'm going to take this lady here. If someone's got a mic. I know there's someone back there, and it's okay.
Asia Bensal Halawi, Professor of Law and Ambassador at Large of Morocco. You have said that the G20 is about leadership, but this leadership has to be inclusive and especially speak for the voiceless. We have seen that in North Africa, the uprising reasons are as socio-economic as the demand for democratic participation. And we see now Tunisia and Egypt in danger. So do you think that there is no role for the G20 to come with massive, effective support to see democracy emerge? Otherwise, it is at risk.
The gentleman next to you, and then I'm going to go back to the panel, but I know I've got one there and one there. It's okay, I haven't forgotten.
Thank you. My name is Bahadır Kaliagisi. I am from TÜSİAD, Turkish Business and Industry Association. When the first G20 meeting was about to be held, I remember that cartoon in the International Herald Tribune showing all the leaders around the table and Prime Minister Gordon Brown opening the session in saying that, dear colleagues, now we have a choice between more government or much more government. Now, of course, the time changed. Or the crisis is not now all over the world. In some G20 countries, there is a different situation. Meanwhile, in my country, in Turkey, we are out of crisis. There's good growth, and we are ready to relaunch our EU membership process. In other countries, there are different situations. And meanwhile, your government also took the initiative to include a business dimension to this G20 meetings, again in a meeting in London, and TÜSİAD started to participate to these platforms to represent the Turkish business community. And last G20 meeting in Seoul was also a scene for an interaction between the business communities of the G20 countries and the political leaders. Now, are we coming to a situation where we can start to talk about a choice between more business and much more business? Can we really now, maybe in all these international settings, not only in the G20 but in the WTO, and in other settings, can we head towards a more global or worldwide business issues to really introduce maybe a new consciousness of being part of global economy, also with more global entrepreneurship and global exchange of technologies? And can G20 play a role in this? Thank you.
Okay, so there are four very good, diverse questions, from who's going to pay attention to these indicators, to China, to the business, very important dimension. And equally, shouldn't the G20 be doing now for the Middle East and North Africa what one General Marshall did for Europe half a century or so ago? I don't think you all feel you don't have to answer all of them, but I'm going to make sure that they are all answered in one way or another. So why don't I? I'm going to start. I'm going to start with Pascal. Pick a couple of those questions and give us some answers.
Let me take the effectiveness and the China question. On effectiveness, and I won't go back to what both Bob and I said on the fact that the G20 is one element, and the effectiveness which we have to look at is the effectiveness of the system at large, not just the effectiveness of the G20. These issues of macroeconomic imbalances and how can you address them is a typical problem of international cooperation. If you're a national leader, the question is, how much of the problems of the others will I factor in my own domestic economic policy? And the virtue of the G20, as by the way, the virtue of the former G8 whose corpse in waiting of a funeral, the virtue of the G20 is to print this question as often as possible into leaders' mind. Okay. They are accountable to their domestic politics. The G20 creates another sort of accountability. And I think what's been done since Seoul on the multilateral surveillance process will lead to better discussions, not least because you will have entrusted a third party, which is the IMF, to report on the evolution of these numbers. The discussion about the numbers is very complex, but you will have triggered a system where there is a sort of transparency, monitoring, surveillance, which is the beginning of international governance. So it will take time. Of course, countries around the G7 table on the finance are fighting like dogs that I want this indicator because it's good for me, and I don't want this indicator because it's bad for me, so there'll have to be a compromise, but I think it's a good start. On China, let me just take two examples. The Chinese liked when Bob was in another position and he coined this notion that China had to become a stakeholder of the international system. They liked it. They profoundly disliked the notion that there would be or should be a G2. So I think this gives a sort of frame within which the Chinese operate. They recognize that where they are now, they have become major stakeholders, but they don't want to be seen as a sort of a US-like country that dominates the planet because of its hyperpower. And of course, what many people still do not realize is that China is a huge developing country, and that China faces the challenges in big style of what many smaller developing countries have to face in social problems, in development, in regional imbalances, in poverty, and that's what inevitably drives a large part of their agenda. Plus the fact that, like India, like Indonesia, like Mexico, the G20 style of diplomacy is not familiar to them. This sort of hybrid diplomacy which is not bilateral, but which is not multilateral UN-like, their power systems are not geared to that. The notion that you have a Sherpa in the Chinese system, that there is one person that speaks for the president, that will say what the president will say, and the president will say what the Sherpa has said, is something which is it's something which is unknown to them.
I'm going to move on now. Gordon Brown, how did you find dealing with Hu Jintao when you were putting this together? And do you think this, these cultural and different institutional approaches, we can get over those? And also then please do address some of the other questions.
I think you've got to look at what's in the interests of China, what's in the interests of America, and what's in the interests of the major powers as well as the smaller countries in the world. And we're really approaching a new test of international economic cooperation. You cannot imagine a solution to the problems that North Africa and the Middle East face without some international support and international cooperation to back them up. I cannot imagine that the world is going to grow and solve the unemployment problem we've got without greater international economic cooperation. So the question is, can that happen? Now, what the IMF did was, at the request of the G20, draw up what was effectively a growth plan. And they argued that if China was to increase its consumption faster, and if America was to rebalance its public consumption and public investment, and if Europe was able to do economic reform that would tackle its unemployment, then the world economy would grow by 4% faster by 2014. And you'd have 50 million more jobs, I think was the figure. Therefore, the basis of international economic cooperation in terms of there being winners, China winning and America winning and Europe winning, is actually there. And it's a question then of whether there's a political will to see it through. Now, what are the difficulties? One is there is no natural constituency for global action. People in their own individual countries, when they see a problem, expect politicians to be able to solve that problem at a national level. And most politicians appeal to people on the basis that I can solve that problem. Indeed, they redefine the problem so that it is a national problem, so they can give the impression that they can solve it. And that's why all around the world deficit reduction has become the issue, when actually it's only one of the issues, and the bigger issue perhaps is growth and employment. The second thing is, of course, the public tends to become protectionist in a period of crisis. And therefore, whether it's in America or whether it's anti-immigrant parties in Europe, people tend to retreat into the national shells. Thirdly, with due respect, I think a great number of business leaders are global in both their outlook and in their attitude. But as a constituency, business does not press for global international action for fear that may mean global regulation. And then you've got ideological divisions between your politicians. I mean, when you talked about more government or much more government as the ideological division at the G20, it reflects that there is a right and there is a left in world politics as well. So the question is, given all these difficulties that make global cooperation really very difficult indeed, can you overcome them by showing the benefits of global cooperation? Now, I think you can, in terms of the economic benefits, the trade benefits, the prosperity benefits, and the employment benefits. And I think if the G20 and the organizations around the G20, which it marshals together with some effect at a period of crisis, cannot come together to deal with these problems that we face now, then the disillusionment with international cooperation will become so great that you will be into another period of protectionism. So it is a real test, and there's an urgency about this, because there are huge problems in the Middle East that we can play a part in helping with, but equally there are problems of food prices, youth unemployment, and actually low growth in Europe and America, all of which, in my view, is avoidable. We are going through, for Europe and America, a wasted decade if we don't take the sort of action that I'm talking about.
Okay. Bob Zoellick, a colleague from Morocco, says, G20 should we're at a pretty historic moment here. The G20 should be doing a bit more than sort of nodding in the direction of North Africa and the Middle East. It should be galvanizing a global economic response, development response.
Yeah, I want to take on that one and a couple of the others. I do think the G20 can and should play a role in this. I think it's much more than money. There's some critical policy issues here. And indeed, one of the dangers is just looking at the short term. We're going to have to look at short, medium, and long term. There will need to be some short-term support particularly to avoid some of the dangers in the transition period. But some of the underlying problems, the youth bulge, the fact you got a bloated public sector in a lot of these countries, unless you also get at those at the same time with some medium and long-term efforts, you're not going to be able to be successful. So I think that also needs to be combined with one other thing, which we talked about, which is what's happening in these countries. The public is engaged in the economic policies, so we also need to have some aspects related to social accountability, the governance, how this is connected to economic policy. 20 years ago at the World Bank, you couldn't use the word corruption. It was political. Now it's an integral part of everything that we do. Well, similarly, some of these social accountability issues are going to be seen as political to some people, but they're going to need to be part of the development process. Coming to the question about rebalancing. The indicators discussion in some ways is a carryover from the initial debate about the role, and it's one of these things that has to be done. It takes too much time. It spends endless negotiations on a few words, but it partly sets up the system for the future in the review. But the key discussions that go on in that table are really going to have to lead to national decisions, and nobody should pretend that it's going to be any otherwise. Do not underestimate, however, the fact that those discussions can influence national decisions. I mean, keep in mind, governments aren't unitary things. You have different people in governments with different perspectives. You have different people in the countries in perspectives. So, for example, the central bank in China may have a slightly different view on currency appreciation given its concern about inflation than others do. But on the fundamental issue of restructure or rebalancing, it's going to be a question of China, which has already said it wants to move towards a greater amount of consumption than savings. It, however, tends to believe less in the market signals, and it believes it needs to make some of the structural changes that are in the 12th five-year plan. The U.S. has the reverse problem. But if you want to give an example of how creative people could use the G20, one of the things that I wrote in his newspaper in advance of the Seoul Summit was the fact that if you had the U.S. and China show up at the G20 and both pledge a series of actions, in the United States case to deal with some of its rebalancing issues in terms of budget deficit and savings, the Chinese with some of the structural aspects, that would send a signal on both substance and cooperation. So that's where you try to connect these together. On China, Charles Grant's question, very important, and I want to, because you talked about foreign policy. My experience has been in the economic area, the engagement as stakeholders is actually pretty well developed. And a lot of it depends if you can learn how to work with the Chinese system. And let me give you a practical example. In the past year, we had to do another commitment for IDA, the fund that we raise money for the 79 poorest countries because we use grants and very low or no interest loans. I knew the developed countries were under stress. We talked with China, even though it's no longer an IDA recipient, it has a lot of old IDA credits out there because these run 40 years. So we worked with the Chinese to do an early repayment of a lot of their IDA credits, which added, frankly, $2 to $3 billion to the pot, much more than grant money. Now, this is an example, going back to what Pascal said. They were being treated differently than the developed countries. It wasn't just putting grant money in. But they could design something that shows that they contribute. But frankly, if I had just popped this out in the public, I think the reaction would have been negative. If you work with them in the process, you can get them to cooperate. But it's not time in this session, but the distinction you draw with the foreign policy is critical. What I see is the engagement with Chinese officials on economic issues at the private sector, the public sector, is now quite dense and networked. There's going to be disagreements as there are between the U.S. and Europe, but I can see the process working its way through. The foreign policy and security area, I'll just say those ties are nowhere near as deep or networked, and they're going to need to be. And then the last point on the private sector, I would just say I think this is in some ways reflects the difference between the London summit and now. One of the issues that we talked about in London was the handoff to the private sector. And another way of viewing some of these debates that you hear in Europe and the United States is what's the right policy mix for a handoff to the private sector? Will the private sector take it? Will ongoing stimulus programs actually make them fearful that there are going to be big taxes to pay? Others will say, no, you have to continue the stimulus because otherwise, they're not ready to bring in the demand. What type of regulatory system, what sort of opportunity for the private sector to come back. So this is one where I think actually the G20 has to be a little bit careful. If you're going to get the private sector engaged, of course it can't come through orders. You have to try to create the environment in which it will occur.
Are they getting it right, Michel Pebberot? Are they creating the right environment for the private sector to be more engaged?
It's an answer to the question about business, yes. I think that it's possible for the G20 to be very useful to create a good environment for the business sector. First of all, I think that one of the main targets for the G20 will be to try to have as high as possible an economic growth with a balanced economy. It's a very difficult task up to now because you have on one hand too much money at the level of the world, and on the other hand too high public debts and public deficits in each developed country. And so you have to find a good balance, a good coordination between the G20 people to find a way of a more balanced growth and as high as possible a growth. Number two, at the level of financial stability, the G20 has to take care of, the balance between financial stability on one hand and economic growth on the other hand. We are in a situation in which there is a high risk to have an overreaction of the regulators about financial stability, which would have as a consequence, especially in Europe, where banking intermediation is very important to finance the economy, to have a risk to have an insufficient financing of the economy, especially in Europe. And so it's a matter of concern for everybody, and it is clear that at the political level, the G20 has the capacity to balance between the two targets, which are on the long run financial stability and on the short term sufficient economic growth.
Okay, very interesting point, getting that balance right between growth again and stability, although I suspect as banks are going to struggle to win the argument about overreaction. I've got one here, one at the back here, and one here, and then I'm going to look again.
Thank you. Peter Kellner from Britain. I run a polling and market research company called YouGov. A question particularly for Gordon Brown and Bob Zoellick. For a decade or so up to 2007, the central banks of Britain, continental Europe and America were all pretty successful in pursuing a strategy which gave us low inflation and steady growth. Then came the crisis, the G20 meeting in London, and massive accommodation in monetary policy. My question is, has the time come to return to the principles of monetary policy and tightness and fighting inflation that we had before 2007? Or is there a risk that would dent growth, dent the recovery, and partially undermine some of the gains made following the G20 meeting in London?
Thank you. This gentleman here.
I'm Dan Rundy, United States CSIS. Question for the panel about international development. There's a significant development track at the G20. Is the G20 a potential platform for integrating development across trade and economic governance issues? And how do you circle the issue of development in an era of new austerity?
Thank you. This gentleman here.
My name is Michael Hansen, entrepreneur from Sweden. I'd like to raise the platform a little bit. We are putting out fires by the day, and that is, you're doing a fantastic job in that. Mr. Lemme, you were talking about leadership. How can there be leadership without visionaries? I see a complete lack of visions in politics today. What is going to happen, and what are our goals for 2020? It's not far away, it's just around the corner. But do we have any visions for what is going to happen then and even further on? Thank you.
Thank you. And this gentleman just here.
Thank you. My name is João Valde Almeida. I'm the EU representative in the United States and the authority of the lady sitting just in front of me. You see that I have a strategic approach to seating. But I would like to draw on my experience as a member of a secret society known by a Sherpa community, of which Pascal is a prominent member. So I want to tell you that I was lucky enough as G20 Sherpa to have my leaders say more or less what I said before. So our system was relatively functional. That was not the case for all my colleagues, I must acknowledge, as Pascal was saying. 2 comments on 1 question, if I may. First comment is to say that the G20 was, to a large extent, inspired by a transatlantic leadership. Even before London, in Washington, it was basically the Americans and the Europeans that drove this process. And I think this should be acknowledged here. Secondly, my last meeting of Sherpa preparing a summit was before Toronto. And I must say that I left the G20 process worried. When we began in Washington and London, we were saying basically, your problem is my problem. And that's why we're here together. What I heard from some, which I will not identify, before Toronto was, your problem is your problem. Do you take care of that? I don't want to be bothered by that. And I thought this was a worrying development. So my question is, do you share my concerns? And secondly, do you believe that the transatlantic leadership is still relevant and necessary?
Now, we've got just 10 minutes left in this session, so I'm relying on our panel to be jotting down the questions that they want to answer, because I'm going to take two more and then we have to call it a day. So there's this gentleman here in the middle. This one here. And then the gentleman behind, and then I'm afraid I have to call it a day.
Thank you. This is Mohammed Abu Shakr from the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. I just have a small comment and a question. The comment is, why do I have the feeling that either we talk about the representation in the G20 and the global governance, I feel that governance is not a real democratic one and not a real very well represented one. I mean, if I see from a Middle Eastern point of view, I don't consider Saudi Arabia as a real representative of the situation there, especially after the revolution. The question is, before the revolution and in 2007, Egypt, for instance, got the first rank in doing business of the World Bank as the biggest economic reformer. And it got 100 million FDI in 2007. But that doesn't have any trickle-down effect into the people. And the World Bank initiated the Arab World Initiative before even the revolution and launched it in the Arab Summit. My question is, does all that kind of policies and outlook into the Middle East economy reviewed and re-evaluated? Is the Arab World Initiative, for instance, still in the same structure and point of view that was before the revolution and the reform and the spring started? Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman just behind, and then we're going to come back.
Thank you. My name is Dan Price, and like my friend Joao, I too belong to that Society of Sherpas, formerly. My question is this. I quite agree with Joao that the first two summits in Washington and London were crisis summits, and so the unity and common purpose that was born of the pressures of the crisis manifested itself in those actions. Pittsburgh was already transitional from crisis management to macroeconomic governance, and so question to the panel is, what is going to supply the glue and the urgency for common purpose once the G20 assumes the role of macroeconomic governance rather than crisis management? And one particular question to Gordon Brown and Pascal Lamy. Mr. Prime Minister, you were an advocate of direct leader involvement in the Doha negotiations. I was on the receiving end of that. I remember very well. And you will also recall that President Sarkozy, President Calderon, and President Lula at the first G20 summit advocated direct leader involvement in concluding the Doha negotiations. Pascal Lamy has said leaders have no business negotiating tariff lines. That may be. On the other hand, when leaders just say, let's get it done, it doesn't happen. So what is the role of leaders in completing the round? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. How many people haven't been a Sherpa in the room? There's a large number of questions there. Just to take a few of the thoughts, do we need glue, as our last speaker said, or do we need vision? Have we taken our eye off inflation? Does the transatlantic motor still operate? I'm just going to go this way across the panel and invite you to pick one or two of those issues to wind up. So, Michel Pebro.
So perhaps the issue of imbalances at the level of monetary policies, I really consider that there is a necessity to come back to normal monetary policies. But the question is to know at what moment, of course. And it's not so easy to decide. As you know, we are in a period of time in which, difficulties appear quite everywhere. The disaster of Japan, problems in the Middle East, North Africa, every day new problems. And so my feeling is that the main issue today at the level of the G20, one of the main issues, is to stay committed at the level of the necessity of a good coordination of economic and monetary policies worldwide. Because we are always in a situation in which it's possible to create new bubbles in markets, and with new bubbles, new problems. We are in a period of time when investors worry about the situation of some public debt worldwide. And so there is a necessity to have a very close cooperation between governments at the level of the G20 to make this situation as under control as possible. So my feeling is that on the field of monetary policies, it is very clear that we are out of the way of classical policies. I have mentioned that we create too much money at the level of the world, so we will have to recontrol, but the question is at what moment precisely.
Thank you. Pascal Lamy.
Should the G20 have and keep a development agenda? My strong answer to that is yes. And I think we owe it to UK at the time and still today, and to Korea, that there remains a strong development agenda for the G20. Development is a global issue and will be more and more of a global issue. So that's, I think, absolutely necessary. And whether you look at what needs to be done in investment, what needs to be done in environment, these questions cannot be disconnected from development. Lack of visions, there's no shortage of visions 10, 20, 30 years from now in many international organizations. The problem, to be frank, is that not many of these G20 leaders are interested in this. Their horizon is not 10, 20 years. There were a few exceptions, and one of these brilliant few exceptions is sitting with us today. He probably would not be sitting with us today, by the way, if he had remained Prime Minister. I mean, Gordon is a very specific Gordon is a very specific case, and he has always, he's the sort of guy that would ring Bob, that would ring me, would say, I have this problem, what do you think about this, can you give me a paper? An exception. And that's your problem. You elect them. On Dan Price's question, which is what can leaders do to conclude the DDA? Again, leaders will not negotiate tariff lines on plastic bags against tariff lines on PVC. What leaders can do is tell their negotiators, go, solve this problem, find a good compromise. I'm ready to take a bit of risk with my chemical industry lobby. By the way, both in Washington and in Beijing. And the chemical industry lobby in Beijing, as some of you may know, is not a small thing. It's two huge things which are called Sinopec and Sinochem. So that's what they can do. Of course they're not going to negotiate the tariff lines, but they can give the cover. And for the moment, they haven't done that. Last point on this. The logo of the G20 should be the title of a book which Putnam, who was the best specialist of symmetry in the 90s, published at that time a book which was titled Hanging Together. That's what should be on the table of the G20. That's what people should have in mind. That's what is it about. They hang together, and whether they find collective solutions or not will make a huge difference at the end of the day. But that's, I think, the sort of spirit in which they've been working, and they have to keep working.
Thank you. Robert Selleck. There was a question on monetary to me, and I would just say, caution number one, you mentioned the period before the crash as being a good one in terms of inflationary discipline. I think one of the lessons is maybe not so good in terms of asset price inflation. People were always focusing on goods inflation. I don't mean to suggest this is easy, but one of the lessons is going to be how you manage asset price inflation as well. Second, I deal a lot with developing countries. So part of the problem with this whole issue that we've been touching on is we have a multi-speed recovery. Emerging markets are already quite recovered, growing fast. If anything, their problem now is overheating, risk of asset price inflation, bubbles, and perhaps boom bust. So frankly, while you can't generalize across all of them, I think they better darn well be thinking about some of the aspects related to monetary policy along with currencies and other types of financial policies. As for developed countries, nice try. I'll let Gordon do it that way. On the integration of development through the G20, keep in mind one of the big pluses here is we now have a lot of developing countries around the table. So they're very, very interested in this. And the Koreans, to their credit, helped move this forward. You talked about can the G20 integrate this. I think just to give you some examples, this trade finance is a good example of how there's an issue that dealt with banking, it dealt with development, a series of aspects, and you could use some of the contributors to help advance the agenda. And by the way, it's not done because, as Pascal and I both identified, I think the Basel III capital requirements for trade finance don't make sense. And this is we brought this to the attention of the Basel people. They're now going to try to overhaul it. I think this is one other lesson, by the way, with the whole banking supervision area, which is build in some feedback loops because nobody's going to get all this right the first time. More specifically, Sub-Saharan Africa, an issue we've been discussing with the French, I think we could combine some aspects of infrastructure development that could also fit very well with the trade side. And so this is a good way in which the G20 could connect them. You asked a little bit about the funding. Keep in mind, about half of global growth now comes from emerging markets. So one of the funding sources is we have to get beyond a north-south model to be thinking of south-south and even south-north. And by the way, a lot of the funding is going to come from the private sector. So how do you create the environment? The question third on Egypt and the Middle East. This bears a longer answer, which I don't have time for now. But number one, you keep in mind there were some things accomplished. If you look at things of infant mortality, child health, some of the growth statistics, there were advances in Egypt, as well as some of the other countries. But the key lesson is that it wasn't enough. There was a partial modernization process. The system was too sclerotic. And as do we and others need to learn from this? Of course. I mean, the idea that you keep your policy on autopilot in this context would be crazy. But let's go take this one step further. What are the first things that Egypt is doing? They're doing what they did in the past. They're increasing wages for everybody, and they're increasing generalized subsidies, and they're going to blow a hole in their budgets. And we're going to have to get through that period, but now we can actually take some lessons from other developing countries like Mexico and Brasilia and Brazil that have actually had very effective targeted safety net programs for about 0.5% or 1% of GDP. Second, jobs. This is where the economists often stumble. Economists hate short-term job creation because they think that it often isn't lasting. We at the World Bank have had some experience now where if you create some public sector jobs so as to avoid a social explosion, but do it in a way that you watch the wages so they don't interfere with the private sector, maybe build some other skills, you might be able to bridge that gap. Third, I know there's some concern in some of these countries that says, oh, look, we don't have time to take measures to deal with regulation and other things. They're going to have to take time because, remember, it was a street vendor who was over-regulated in Tunisia that set all this off. And so we have to try to figure out how we can at least start to send some signals about small business, entrepreneurialism, and other issues. But I keep coming back to this point about the social accountability and governance. We worked with the Egyptian government on developing a Freedom of Information Act. There were some reformers, as you know, that were trying to push this through. Others didn't. I think part of the way we can connect the politics with the economics in this is trying to take some of these lessons, whether it's democratic or not, about better governance and social accountability, community development programs so the local communities get the financing. So I think there's a lot of steps that we could take. The last comment on the G20 is this. I think keep in mind these meetings need to focus on different stages. So, for example, I believe that I've made the point about putting food first. I think the food price issue is going to be both a short and a medium long-term issue. I think there's a lot of things that can be done. Take international monetary system. I don't think that the international order is ready for a big boom, but I do think we could make some changes in the framework that might actually plant the seeds for the future, and I also wrote these up in your paper.
Thank you. Gordon Brown.
I think the international attitude presented by all these questions makes me hopeful about global cooperation for the future. And I'm not one to criticize Sherpas, because I think Sherpas have kept that global cooperation alive, sometimes when politicians have lost interest. And you know what they say about politicians. It was very true of me at the last election. It was said by Shelley about his mother-in-law, she'd lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. And that may be what you think of some of the contributions that politicians make to international economic cooperation, because my thesis is basically this, that we are retreating international silos at a time when international economic cooperation is more needed than ever. And look at Africa, which has been mentioned. Africa, 15% of the population of the world, rising to 20% of the population of the world, but roughly speaking, only 1% of the investment of the world, 1% of the manufacturing of the world, 1% of the wealth of the world, 1% of the middle class of the world. That is not a sustainable situation, given the rising population of Africa, particularly the rising population of young people. And it cannot be solved without international economic cooperation bolstering those governments in Africa that are prepared to make the reforms. And take the Middle East and North Africa. Youth unemployment is at 30 or 40% in some of these countries. When it dies down as a protest and they start having to elect new governments, and these governments are incapable of solving these problems of unemployment and economic development, you will have further social tensions unless we can find a way of supporting these new governments in creating jobs for the future. Now, as I see, and people ask about vision, what's going to happen? The world economy over the next 10 years, you've had this massive productive power shifting to Asia. You're now going to have this massive power of consumption shifting to Asia. You're going to have a rise of a global middle class that is not just European and American, but principally Asian in terms of its numbers. But large numbers of people around the world are going to feel excluded. And it's not just Africa. It's people where there is growth but no equity, as in some countries in Asia as well. And large numbers of people are going to feel excluded in Europe and America, because it looks as if unemployment is going to remain high and growth is going to be about half the rate it used to be in the last 20 years. Now, can you bring people together with such a common cause that international cooperation can make for a world that is better than without it? And my answer is clearly yes. Cooperation, I don't think we've begun to deal with the problems that arise from the international banking crisis in terms of long-term solutions. I don't think the Global Stability Board will come up with the answers, and it certainly will not have an early warning system without a further ability on the part of politicians to accept that you need global standards and not just national standards, implemented nationally, but global standards. I don't think we've exhausted the potential for coordination to deal with the imbalances around the world, and particularly with the likelihood that Europe and America will not grow fast enough unless there is greater international cooperation with an Asia that is prepared to consume more. But these seem to be problems that are soluble with political will. I mean, our objectives are growth, equity, and environmental care. It's a trinity of economic and objectives. These can be pursued within international forums. It doesn't need one organization, but a set of multilateral organizations. The problem at the moment is what someone has called minilateralism. there is too little international cooperation at the moment to justify us being able to say we are seriously dealing with the problems like food prices, like energy, and like the problems of poverty and inequality that I've discussed. I think we should be far more optimistic about our ability to do these things and then press, whether it's by global public action pressing our leaderships or our leaderships themselves taking the action so that some of these problems, which are clearly capable of international solutions and clearly in businesses' interest that we begin to solve, are actually firmly on the international agenda in a way that people just don't sit around and talk about it, but actually have to come to agreements and make decisions and then implement the decisions in their own regional areas. So I'm optimistic if we can get that political will, and I think the potential exists for that cooperation, but it is not being explored in the proper way at the moment because people are tending, because of protectionism, to retreat into the national silos.
Thank you, Gordon Brown, and I think this has been a tremendous conversation. I was going to say that we produced a full agenda for Nicolas Sarkozy for the rest of the year. It did occur to me that the President of the Republic doesn't usually let other people write his agendas, but let's hope we can be an exception. I think we should thank our panel, all those who contributed.
And thank you, Philip.
Craig.
That was really terrific. We're going to take the panel off to go to a press conference. It's now time for lunch. If you signed up for lunch, on your badge there's a number. You've got about 5 minutes to grab a coat.